Hi, everybody. Welcome back to CMN 201. This is for our class for Wednesday, the 24th. Where we left off is I asked you to watch Dracula and to determine whether or not you thought, after viewing that particular film, was it really aesthetically and culturally and socially important. And it seems that just about unanimously all of you did. If for no other reason, Dracula and Bela Lugosi's performance has become iconic in our particular society. And if the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari is going to be the example of the first horror film ever made, at least feature length, then Dracula is the example of the first American horror film ever made. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to give Dracula and also talk a little bit about its Gothic tradition. And you'll remember that we had talked a little bit about the Gothic at the beginning of the semester and how the Gothic helped to establish many of the conventions and tropes that we've become accustomed to in horror film. And the Gothic being a kind of writing in the 1800s that utilized conventions such as possible supernatural happenings, dark and eerie environments, pursuer and pursued. And it was the heyday of novels such as not only Dracula, but Frankenstein and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and all of them in the 1930s, which is the period of time we happen to be in, were quite successful through Universal Studios. Now, the 1930s were a particularly challenging time, though I wonder if there's any decade that hasn't been particularly challenging in one way or another. But when you think about the need for escapism in the 30s because of the Great Depression, and how ultimately the horrors on screen were a way to escape from the horrors of real life. And I had asked you to read 1930 studio horrors from your Nightmares book, and also Reality Bites. Get it? Bites. Chapter 11. And that also talks about oh, I'm sorry, that's chapter 10. And then chapter 11 talks about Todd Browning, who directed this particular film. And I think I told you that he also directed Freaks, which was a very famous, or is a very famous film, because he actually used real circus freaks, and that disturbed many audience members. And the film was banned for many, many years because of that. But I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the folklore associated with Dracula, as well as indicate that now we're at the point in the semester where you've got journals due. So now that we've put some closure onto the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, you can hand in your first journal, and some of you have already handed in your journals on Dr. Caligari. Thank you very much. And I'm asking for approximately a page or so, though it can be as long as you'd like it to be, of thoughts or reflections or ideas that you have about the film. And I evaluate it informally. I don't review it for grammar or mechanics, just for content. And I will review it, add some comments, and then put a check mark grade on it, with a plus being excellent, a check plus being very good, a check being satisfactory. And there's also less than satisfactory and unsatisfactory, but most of the grades end up in that place. And return that to you. So please send that to me, to my email, Ruiz, R-U-I-Z, at gcc.mass.edu via PDF, and then I can get that back to you. And then what you will end up doing is basically handing in a journal every week for the rest of the semester on the films that we are viewing. And certainly you can reference any of the readings that we've done prior to the films or that we're doing with the films, because the readings are supposed to help supplement part of what we're talking about the films. But as a horror film class, and you're actually viewing horror film, not just for entertainment, but viewing it with a critical eye in the way that you would read a piece of literature, that would give you a running commentary on all of the major films we're covering over the course of the semester, which allows for you to have information for the final exam. Not that that is happening anytime soon, but the final happens to be an essay exam, and you have choice within which essay questions to ask. And it's open book, open notes, so you can utilize any of your resources, including things like your journals, to respond to those particular questions. And eventually there will also be a final project that we will continue to discuss over the course of this semester, where you can examine something a little bit more specific or a little bit more in depth about something associated with horror film. And your journals might perhaps be a way for you to try out ideas or to at least ask questions about how to proceed with that. When it comes to The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, we could spend multiple classes talking about the idea of that film being an example of German expressionism, or the fact that Caligari has oftentimes been viewed as a symbol of German authoritarian government, in some ways prefiguring a kind of Hitler figure, controlling and manipulating a sleepwalking populace when we think about Caesar in order to perform his dirty work. When the film was first put together, it did not have the opening and the closing frame of Francis in the insane asylum, so the symbolism seemed much starker and realer. The frame helped to soften some of the symbolism, perhaps some of the anxieties that the film was a little bit too political for its time. Definitely outside of the politics, we can talk about the idea of a cabinet and opening a cabinet as a way of getting into one's subconscious. And as we've talked about fear and what's more frightening, what's outside or within us, perhaps the fear of not knowing one's sanity or insanity is one of the greatest fears we could have. And all of those distorted images that we see could very easily be seen as a reflection of an insane person's view of the world, which is why they engage in the actions that they do, which we see with Francis. But even if Francis is completely and totally insane, it's very clear that Caligari is played as a sinister character. So right at the very ending of the play, at the very ending of the film, I should say, when Caligari is saying that he knows the perfect cure, we don't know exactly what that means and how that will help or hurt Francis. So those are just some things you can examine in The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. Gender is always interesting, especially in this time period where obviously female is usually put into the role of victim, and we saw that as well in this particular film. But for Dracula, we've got a more modern film and an American film, so perhaps in some ways that film might seem a little bit more familiar and comfortable. And we also have audio. I know that Cabinet of Dr. Caligari as a silent film is a completely different kind of viewing experience than it would be to listen to a film with audio. Though I'd indicated that Dracula didn't originally have a soundtrack, and that usually orchestras would be playing live in order to have some sort of a soundtrack. But we do have sound effects that can be very haunting in Dracula. And in terms of the folklore associated with Dracula, the name Dracula comes from Dracul, which means the son of the devil. And Dracul, or Dracula, was a cruel Romanian conqueror, and he was known for being quite barbaric. And in fact, there are some woodcuts of him eating dinner surrounded by the victims of his wars, and they all are impaled on stakes. So you can see how some of that imagery was imagery that Bram Stoker used when he was writing Dracula. Dracula was probably also inspired by a short story, ghost story competition, actually, that was held with, of all people, Mary Shelley, a name you might recognize because Mary Shelley is the author of Frankenstein. And it was in that ghost story competition that she had a dream of a dead corpse being reanimated into life, and that was the beginnings of Frankenstein. Now, there was another member of that party. He was known as Dr. Polidori, and he wrote a short story called The Vampire, about a vampire. And we think that Bram Stoker was influenced by that short story as well as the Dracul of history in order to create his Dracula. And the first screen adaptation, which I believe I had indicated in a previous class, was Nosferatu in 1921. And it was a film I almost showed instead of The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, because it also is in the German expressionistic style. But I thought that since we were covering vampires with Dracula, that we would do something a bit different. And also Caligari usually is given the accolades for being the first horror film, so I wanted that for us. his widow, Bram Stoker, tried everything in her power to have Nosferatu destroyed and was almost successful because they basically took the story without giving the appropriate compensation. One copy survived, luckily for all of us, and that's how we have Nosferatu, which is with its incredible use of shadows. And we saw that somewhat with Dr. Caligari as well. Now, Dracula was put into a stage play, a Broadway stage play, before it was made into a film. And many of the conventions of the stage play actually transferred over into the film. Perhaps one of the most iconic images of Dracula is Bela Lugosi in his cape and collar. That cape and collar was actually a stage device for the Broadway play when the vampire needed to transform and disappear. And there would be a trap door on the stage, and basically the cape and collar would be held up with wires so that the actor could descend down the trap door, and what we would see as audience members is just a cape and a collar. And they kept that costume for Dracula. It's also led to this aristocratic air for Dracula. And the film collapses the text, plot, and characters. The text is quite long. It's several hundred pages long. So it isn't necessarily particularly easy to put on film because it is an epistolary novel as well, in addition to its length, which means that it's a story that's told through letters, journal entries, diary entries. So that doesn't necessarily translate that particularly well. When we see Lugosi's version of Dracula, that accent that's become so iconic, is actually part of Lugosi himself not being fluent in English. In fact, he needed to learn the role of Dracula phonetically. So he spoke little to no English when he first performed Dracula. And that, of course, has become our image of what Dracula is. And I believe a couple of you mentioned, and I think this was in the reading as well, that his costume with that medallion has oftentimes been likened to the Star of David. And there definitely is this sense of anti-Semitism in this, or if nothing else, a pro-Christian viewpoint. It's hard to ignore that the symbols of Christianity are what ultimately defeat Dracula, along with science. Van Helsing is a man who's able to balance both religion, specifically Christianity, and science at the same time. And there are lots of images in the film that are supposed to be reminiscent of images of Christianity. So, for instance, inside Dracula's castle, if you would have noticed the table that was set out, it very much almost looks like a church altar, right down with the chalice and the candles that would be in a church altar. However, Browning also took some liberties. For instance, I don't know if you caught this or not, but we got a very brief image of an armadillo in that castle, and there is no good reason for there being an armadillo in there. Certainly there are good reasons for bats and rats, but not armadillos. But Browning was fond of armadillos, and I guess when you're the director, you get to decide what it is that you include or don't include. And these great majestic Gothic sets are part of what we think of in terms of the Gothic tradition and horror films. And the victim and victimizer idea, I mentioned this a little bit earlier when I was talking about the female as victim, is something that is definitely more clearly seen in something like Dracula, where his victims are almost all female, and Dracula has oftentimes been read as a symbol, whether it be a symbol of a foreigner that is invading and taking over the European populace, specifically by manipulating and contaminating its females. In other words, the birth pool that will resume after that. So there is a good amount of anti-foreign elements within this particular text, a good amount of xenophobia that could be read in this particular text. Oftentimes, Dracula, too, as bloodsucker, has been seen as a representation of the capitalist. And as an aristocrat, he also has a certain level of gravitas and emotional and social currency. but this bloodsucker that's living off of lesser beings. So that's yet another way that we can view Dracula. And as I had suggested, there have been anti Semitism accusations labeled against Dracula as well, that he is representational of something that is anti Christian and perhaps even Jewish on some levels. The victim and the victimizer, though, I think works really nicely also for some of the sexual references in this particular text. And the next movie we're going to be seeing, Cat People, directly addresses the idea of sexuality. But Dracula is an incredibly sexual film, just like the text Dracula was an incredibly sexual text. Even though it was written in the 1800s, which was the Victorian period, which was known to be highly sexually repressive. And the 1930s were also a rather tame period, and one in which censors would take a good notice of the film. In fact, censors cut out the death groans of Dracula. They thought that they were too suggestive, and they were also too violent. So this sense of victim and victimizer, a female being prey to the aggressor of Dracula. And of course, because of film code, we know that the monster has to be destroyed at the end, which is exactly what we get with Dracula. When we get to more contemporary horror films, the monster does not have to necessarily be destroyed at the end. The symbolism of Dracula is usually how the film is viewed, whether it be that blood-sucking capitalist that I was suggesting, or the evil foreigner, kind of reverse imperialism, if you will, that now the world of Transylvania, and this is seen as this kind of third world backward place, is now coming to invade the former imperialists, which would be Britain. The idea of sexuality, too, can be easily played out with something like the stake, which could be viewed as a phallic symbol, especially when the stake is what's used to kill the vampire. And also the sense of the teeth biting in could be seen as a kind of phallic image. And certainly there's lots of oral eroticism associated with the idea of sucking and biting as well in this particular play, or in this particular film, I should say. And the corruption of female, and how easily female can be corrupted by some sort of foreign influence. The past, too. Dracula represents a past way of life and how that can invade the present and destroy it on many elements. And the animalistic nature of sexuality is something that also is embedded within this particular film. But from a Gothic perspective, as you've indicated with the costuming and you've indicated with the sets, it helps to establish much of what we consider Gothic and much of what we consider to be horror. I don't know if you were paying attention to the changes in costume. As the women become corrupted, their dress becomes much more suggestive. The fact that ultimately we have 3 female vampires that look like they're going to attack a male victim is also quite sexual. 3 is also an important number from a Christian perspective, in that it is suggestive of Trinity, and these 3 vampires have oftentimes been viewed as a kind of anti-Trinity. And the fact that ultimately these 3 vampires have taken the opportunity, or have taken the initiative to have action without Dracula's consent, and of course he pulls them back at that particular point. Also, questions of life and death. What is life and what is death? And can life continue after death? There was this sense of that perhaps, Dracula is a character that can be, at least on some level, empathized with. At one point in the film, he talks about, to be dead, to be truly dead, how truly wonderful that would be. The sense that perhaps death brings peace. And we will visit this idea of life and death when we start getting into things like George Romero and some of his zombie films. So those are just a few of the things to think about in relation to Dracula. I think that if we were to look at the 1930s horror films, generally speaking, Frankenstein is considered to be a superior film. I don't know if any of you have ever seen Frankenstein, but Dracula being the first, it came out before Frankenstein, even though Frankenstein was written before Dracula. I think it's probably the reason why it's considered to be culturally and aesthetically significant in our film registry history. So Cat People was a film that was done in the 1940s. Now, the 1940s was a time that was beginning to embrace psychology more, and there definitely is a psychological element within this particular film. It has a claim to glory if Dr. Caligari was the first horror film, and if Dracula was the first American horror film. Cat People gives us the first jump scare, which of course has become rather iconic in horror movies. And I'm not going to tell you what that jump scare is. I want you to see the film first and then comment on it. And as I indicated, sexuality is definitely going to be a theme that isn't suggested, but is directly addressed in this particular film. So in some ways, it's quite progressive and eyebrow raising for its time. So I don't know if Cat People is as well known as The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari and Dracula, but I suspect what you will find that it is a film that is quite well made, particularly for its time period. It has a very film noir aspect to it. In other words, a step taken outside of German expressionism where you're using shadows in order to be able to communicate mood. Again, we'll see lots of Christian imagery. So already, even though we've only seen a couple of films, we're beginning to see some patterns that are playing over and over again. Issues of mental stability and instability also played out here with Cat People. So what I'll do is I'll leave it here, and I'll let you watch Cat People and ask you for today's attendance question, basically about Cat People, is what did you find to be the most surprising thing about that particular film? My suspicion is that most, if not all of you, have never seen this film before. So what did you think to be the most surprising thing about the film Cat People? I'd be curious to hear what your response happens to be. And then next class, if there are any odds and ends with Dracula, we'll do that. And then we will talk about Cat People and get ready to talk about the 1950s. I'll also talk a little bit more about the final project as well. I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And enjoy Cat People. Take care. Bye-bye.